Hello and welcome to the session on Democritus. Democritus, 460 to 370 BC, was an influential ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher, primarily remembered today for his formulation of an atomic theory of the universe. Democritus was born in Abdera, Thrace, an Ionian colony of Teos. His exact contributions are difficult to disentangle from those of his mentor Leucippus, as they are often mentioned together in texts. Their speculation on atoms taken from Leucippus bears a passing and partial resemblance to the 19th century understanding of atomic structure that has led some to regard Democritus as more of a scientist than other Greek philosophers. However, their ideas rested on very different bases. Largely ignored in ancient Athens, Democritus was nevertheless well known to his fellow northern-born philosopher Aristotle. Plato is said to have disliked him so much that he wished all his books burnt. Many consider Democritus to be the father of modern science. It was said that Democritus' father was so wealthy. Democritus spent the inheritance which his father left him on travels into distant countries to satisfy his thirst for knowledge. He traveled to Asia and was even said to have reached India and Ethiopia. It is known that he wrote on Babylon and Nero. He visited Egypt and lived there for 5 years. He himself declared that among his contemporaries, none had made greater journeys, seen more countries, and met more scholars than himself. He particularly mentions the Egyptian mathematicians, whose knowledge he praises. Theophrastus spoke of him as a man who had seen many countries. After returning to his native land, he occupied himself with natural philosophy. He traveled throughout Greece to acquire a better knowledge of its cultures. He mentions many Greek philosophers in his writings, and his wealth enabled him to purchase their writings. Leucippus, the founder of atomism, was the greatest influence upon him. He also praises Anaxagoras. He was friends with Hippocrates. Aristotle placed him among the pre-Socratic natural philosophers. The many anecdotes about Democritus attest to his disinterest, modesty, and simplicity, and show that he lived exclusively for his studies. One story has him deliberately blinding himself in order to be less disturbed in his pursuits. It may well be true that he lost his sight in old age. He was cheerful and was always ready to see the comical side of life. He always laughed at the foolishness of people. Democritus was popularly known as the laughing philosopher for laughing at human follies. To his fellow citizens, he was also known as the mocker. He was highly esteemed by his fellow citizens because he had foretold them some things which events proved to be true, which may refer to his knowledge of natural phenomena. Democritus died at the age of 90. He was eaten by lice or vermin. Philosophy and science. Most sources say that Democritus followed in the tradition of Leucippus, and they carried on the scientific rationalist philosophy associated with Miletus. Both were thoroughly materialist, believing everything to be the result of natural laws. Unlike Aristotle or Plato, the atomists attempted to explain the world without reasoning as to purpose, prime mover, or final cause. For the atomists, questions of physics should be answered with a mechanistic explanation. What earlier circumstances caused this event? While their opponents searched for explanations which, in addition to the material and mechanistic, also included the formal and teleological. What purpose did this event serve? Aesthetics. Democritus wrote theoretically on poetry and fine art. Thrasyllus identified specifically 6 works in his oeuvre which would belong to aesthetics as a discipline, but only fragments of the relevant works are extant. Hence, of all his outpourings on these things, only a few of his ideas are available to know. Proceeding Grecian historians consider him to have established aesthetics as a subject of investigation and study. Epistemology. The knowledge of truth, according to Democritus, is difficult, since the perception through the senses is subjective. As from the same senses derive different impressions for each individual, then through the sense impressions we cannot judge the truth. We can only interpret the sense data through the intellect and grasp the truth because the truth is at the bottom. Democritus says that either there is no truth or to us at least it is not evident. Further, he added, by convention hot, by convention cold, but in reality atoms and void. And also in reality we know nothing since the truth is at bottom. There are two kinds of knowing. The one he calls legitimate, genuine, and the other bastard, secret. The bastard knowledge is concerned with the perception through the senses. Therefore, it is insufficient and subjective. The reason is that the sense perception is due to the effluences of the atoms from the objects to the senses. When these different shapes of atoms come to us, they stimulate our senses according to their shape, and our sense impressions arise from those stimulations. The second sort of knowledge, the legitimate one, can be achieved through the intellect. In other words, all the sense data from the bastard must be elaborated through reasoning. In this way, one can get away from the false perception of the bastard knowledge and grasp the truth through the inductive reasoning. After taking into account the sense impressions, one can examine the causes of the appearances, draw conclusions about the laws that govern the appearances, and discover the causality, aetiologia, by which they are related. This is the procedure of thought from the parts to the whole, or else from the apparent to non-apparent, inductive reasoning. This is one example of why Democritus is considered to be an early scientific thinker. The process is reminiscent of that by which science gathers its conclusions: indivisibility and mathematics. Democritus was also a pioneer of mathematics and geometry in particular. We only know this through citations of his works in other writings, since most of Democritus' body of work did not survive the Middle Ages. Democritus was among the first to observe that a cone or pyramid has 1/3 the volume of a cylinder or prism respectively with the same base and height. The reasons for supposing that there are indivisible magnitudes apparently stem from the problems posed by Zeno of Elea. Some of Zeno's paradoxes concern the difficulty of crossing a finite magnitude if it is understood to be infinitely divisible, that is, composed of an infinite number of parts. The atomists may have sought to avoid these paradoxes by supposing that there is a limit to divisibility. It is not clear, however, in what sense the atoms are said to be indivisible and how the need for smallest magnitudes is related to the claim that atoms are indivisible. The atomists may not have distinguished between physical and theoretical indivisibility of the atoms. The physical indivisibility of the atoms seems to be independent of the argument for indivisible magnitudes, since the solidity of atoms is said to be the reason why they cannot be split. The existence of void space between atoms is cited as the reason why they can be separated. One late source, Philoponus, even suggests that atoms could never actually touch, lest they fuse. Whether or not Democritus himself saw this consequence, it seems that atoms are taken to be indivisible whatever their size. Presumably, though, there is a smallest size of atom, and this is thought to be enough to avoid the paradoxes of infinite divisibility. Aristotle suggests that the atoms argued from the assumption that if a magnitude is infinitely divisible, nothing prevents it actually having been divided at every point. The atomist then asks, what would remain? If the answer is some extended particles, such as dust, then the hypothesized division has not yet been completed. If the answer is nothing or points, then the question is how an extended magnitude could be composed from what does not have extension. Democritus is also said to have contributed to mathematics and to have posed a problem about the nature of the cone. He argues that if a cone is sliced anywhere parallel to its base, the two faces thus produced must either be the same in size or different. If they are the same, however, the cone would seem to be a cylinder. But if they are different, the cone would turn out to have step-like rather than continuous sides. Although it is not clear from Plutarch's report how or if Democritus solved the problem, it does seem that he was conscious of questions about the relationship between atomism as a physical theory and the nature of mathematical objects. Atomic and void hypothesis. The theory of Democritus held that everything is composed of atoms which are physically but not geometrically indivisible. That between atoms there lies empty space. That atoms are indestructible, have always been and always will be in motion. That there are an infinite number of atoms and kinds of atoms which differ in shape and size. Of the mass of atoms, the more any indivisible exceeds, the heavier it is. But his exact position on weight of atoms is disputed. Leucippus is widely credited with being the first to develop the theory of atomism. Democritus, along with Leucippus and Epicurus, proposed the earliest view on the shapes and connectivity of atoms. They reasoned that the solidness of the material corresponds to the shape of the atoms involved. Thus, iron atoms are solid and strong with hooks that lock them into a solid. Water atoms are smooth and slippery. Salt atoms, because of their taste, are sharp and pointed. And air atoms are light and whirling, pervading all other materials. Using analogies from our sense experiences, he gave a picture or an image of an atom that distinguished them from each other by their shape, their size, and the arrangement of their parts. Moreover, connections were explained by material links in which single atoms were supplied with attachments, some with hooks and eyes, others with balls and sockets. The Democritian atom is an inert solid that interacts with other atoms mechanically. In contrast, modern quantum mechanical atoms interact via electric and magnetic force fields and are far from inert. The theory of the atomist appears to be more nearly aligned with that of modern science than any other theory of antiquity. However, the similarity with modern concepts of science can be confusing when trying to understand where the hypothesis came from. It is obvious that classical atomists would never have had a solid empirical basis for our modern concepts of atoms and molecules. Bertrand Russell states that they just hit on a lucky hypothesis, only recently confirmed by evidence. Many properties of materials must derive from something inside that will itself never decay, something that stores for eternity the same inherent indivisible properties. The basic question is, why has everything in the world not yet decayed? And how can exactly the same materials, plants, animals, be recreated again and again? One obvious solution to explain how indivisible properties can be conveyed in a way not easily visible to human senses is to hypothesize the existence of atoms. These classical atoms are nearer to our modern concept of molecule than to the atoms of modern science. The other big point of classical atomism is that there must be a lot of open space between these atoms, the void. Luceritus gives reasonable arguments that the void is absolutely necessary to explain how gases and liquids can change shape, flow, while metals can be molded without changing the basic material properties. Void hypothesis. The atomistic void hypothesis was a response to the paradoxes of Parmenides and Zeno, the founders of metaphysical logic, who put forth difficult to answer arguments in favor of the idea that there can be no movement. They held that any movement would require a void, which is nothing. But a nothing cannot exist. The Parmenidean position was, you say there is a void, therefore the void is not nothing. Therefore, there is not the void. The position of Parmenides appeared validated by the observation that where there seems to be nothing, there is air. And indeed, even where there is not matter, there is something. For instance, light waves. The atomists agreed that motion required a void, but simply ignored the argument of Parmenides on the grounds that motion was an observable fact. Therefore, they asserted there must be a void. This idea survived in a refined version as Newton's theory of absolute space, which met the logical requirements of attributing reality to not being. Einstein's theory of relativity provided a new answer to Parmenides and Zeno, with the insight that space by itself is relative and cannot be separated from time as part of a generally curved space-time manifold. Consequently, Newton's refinement is now considered superfluous. Ethics and politics. The ethics and politics of Democritus come to us mostly in the form of maxims. Despite the large number of ethical sayings, it is difficult to construct a coherent account of Democritus' ethical views. There is a difficulty of deciding which fragments are genuinely Democritian. Equality is everywhere noble, but Democritus is not encompassing enough to include women or slaves in this sentiment. Poverty in a democracy is better than prosperity under tyrants. For the same reason, one is to prefer liberty over slavery. Those in power should take it upon themselves to lend to the poor and to aid them and to favor them. Then is there pity and no isolation, but companionship and mutual defense and concord among the citizens and other good things too many to catalogue. Money when used with sense leads to generosity and charity, while money used in folly leads to a common expense for the whole society. Excessive hoarding of money for one's children is avarice. While making money is not useless, Democritus says doing so as a result of wrongdoing is the worst of all things. He is on the whole ambivalent towards wealth and values, it much less than self-sufficiency. Democritus disliked violence, but was not a pacifist. He urged cities to be prepared for war and believed that a society had the right to execute a criminal or enemy so long as this did not violate some law, treaty, or oath. Democritus believed goodness came more from practice and discipline than from innate human nature. He believed that one should distance oneself from the wicked, stating that such association increases disposition to vice. Anger, while difficult to control, must be mastered in order for one to be rational. Those who take pleasure from the disasters of their neighbors fail to understand that their fortunes are tied to the society in which they live, and they rob themselves of any joy of their own. Democritus believed that happiness was a property of the soul. He advocated a life of contentment with as little grief as possible, which he said could not be achieved through either idleness or preoccupation with worldly pleasures. Contentment would be gained, he said, through moderation and a measured life. To be content, one must set their judgment on the possible and be satisfied with what one has, giving little thought to envy or admiration. Democritus approved of extravagance on occasion, as he held that feasts and celebrations were necessary for joy and relaxation. He considers education to be the noblest of pursuits, but cautioned that learning without sense leads to error. Anthropology, biology, and cosmology. Democritus' work on nature is known through citations of his book on the subjects. He spent much of his life experimenting with and examining plants and minerals, and wrote at length on many scientific topics. Democritus thought that the first humans lived an anarchic and animal sort of life, going out to forage individually and living off the most palatable herbs and the fruit which grew wild on the trees. They were driven together into societies for fear of wild animals, he said. He believed that these early people had no language, but that they gradually began to articulate their expressions, establishing symbols for every sort of object, and in this manner came to understand each other. He says that the earliest men lived laboriously, having none of the utilities of life. Clothing, houses, fire, domestication, and farming were unknown to them. Democritus presents the early period of mankind as one of learning by trial and error, and says that each step slowly led to more discoveries. They took refuge in the caves in winter, stored fruits that could be preserved, and through reason and keenness of mind came to build upon each new idea. Democritus held that the earth was round, spherical, and stated that originally the universe was composed of nothing but tiny atoms churning in chaos until they collided together to form larger units, including the earth and everything on it. He surmised that there are many worlds, some growing, some decaying, some with no sun or moon, some with several. He held that every world has a beginning and an end, and that a world could be destroyed by collision with another world. To epitomize Democritus' cosmology, Russell calls on Shelley. Worlds on worlds are rolling ever, from creation to decay, like the bubbles on a river, sparkling, bursting, borne away. Now let us summarize the major ideas we have discussed so far. Democritus was the first to propose an atomic universe. Leucippus is known by ancient writers as Democritus' teacher, and apparently wrote on many subjects besides atomism. Democritus, known as the laughing philosopher because of the importance he placed on cheerfulness. Democritus was the first philosopher to posit that what we refer to as the Milky Way was the light of stars reaching our perception, and that the universe may in fact be a multiverse with other planets sustaining life. Knowledge of Democritus' life is largely limited to untrustworthy tradition. It seems that he was a wealthy citizen of Abdera in Thrace, that he traveled widely in the East, and that he lived to an advanced age. His works numbered 73. Only a few hundred fragments have survived, mostly from his treatises on ethics. Democritus' physical and cosmological doctrines were an elaborated and systematized version of those of his teacher Leucippus. To account for the world's changing physical phenomena, Democritus asserted that space or the void had an equal right with reality or being to be considered existent. Now you can try to answer the questions given here. Write a short note on the influences of philosophy of Democritus. What are the two kinds of knowledge according to Democritus? What are the views of Democritus on democracy and equality? Explain the epistemological features of Democritus' philosophy. Examine the contributions of Democritus to ancient Greek philosophy. Critically evaluate the Democritus idea of democracy. Explain Democritus' contribution to mathematics. Hope that you may go through the reference books for further understanding. A History of Greek Philosophy, written by W.K.C. Guthrie in 1979, published by Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. The Pre-Socratic Philosophers, written by B. Jonathan in 1982, published by Routledge, New York. Democritus, written by P. Cartledge in 1997, published by Routledge, London. The Legacy of Parmenides, Eleatic Monism and Later Pre-Socratic Thought, written by C. Patricia in 1998, published by Princeton University Press, Princeton. The Greek Cosmologists, written by J. David in 1987, published by Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. The Pre-Socratic Philosophers, written by G. S. Kirk in 1957, published by Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. Philosophy Before Socrates, an introduction with text and commentary, written by D. Richard in 1994, published by Hackett, Indianapolis. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic. Have a nice day.